Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This editorial deals with the rapidly deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. Over the last couple of months, the Taliban has made rapid advances in Afghanistan after it began a new round of offensive from the 1st of May. From this date onwards, the American troops began pulling out from Afghanistan as per the terms of the US Taliban peace deal, which was signed last year in 2020. Over the last few weeks, the American withdrawal of troops has been accelerated, and the eagerness of the Americans to pull out completely was very evident from the discreet manner in which the US vacated its most important military base in Afghanistan, that is the Bagram Air Base. As the American troop withdrawal has been accelerated, the Taliban has stepped up its offensive against the Afghan government and the Afghan forces, and it has been making rapid territorial gains, thereby challenging the Afghan government. See here, we are looking at the map of Afghanistan from 2019, which depicts the territories that were under the control of Taliban and those that were under the control of the government, including the areas that were contested between the Taliban and the Afghan forces. See, traditionally, southern and western Afghanistan has been a stronghold for the Taliban. In regions around the Ghazni province, Kandahar, Helmand, Herat, and across these Pashtun tribal areas, the Taliban has been traditionally dominant since the 1990s. Previously, when Afghanistan was under the rule of the Taliban between 1996 and 2001, and even between 1993 and 1995, when it violently fought the Afghan government to capture power in a similar manner, the southern and the western areas were always the Taliban stronghold. Back in the 1990s, the Taliban was facing some resistance in the northern areas, particularly in and around the Hindu Kush mountains that stretch across Central Asia and into the Wakhan corridor. In these northern areas, Taliban was always resisted by a set of northern tribes which were brought under a coalition known as the Northern Alliance with the covert backing of India, Iran and Russia. Because while Pakistan was seen to be backing the Taliban, the regional powers, that is India, Iran and Russia, which were facing a threat from the Taliban, got together and they covertly sponsored the Northern Alliance as a resistance against the Taliban. But eventually Taliban had overrun the country, captured power, and it had formed the government in Afghanistan between 1996 and 2001. Even after the 9/11 attacks, and even after the United States invaded Afghanistan with a coalition force, the resistance against the Taliban in the northern areas was pretty strong. But right now, a major concern has emerged because in the latest Taliban offensive, these northern areas have been falling very easily. And in the last few weeks, Taliban has made rapid advances across the Hindu Kush mountains. Major provinces like Badakhshan, Kunduz, Takhar have all fallen directly under Taliban control. And according to latest data that is coming out from Afghanistan, nearly 195 districts out of the 407 districts have come under the complete control of the Taliban. And in another 129 districts, the Taliban is posing a strong challenge to the Afghan forces and the Afghan government. But unfortunately, the Afghan troops are completely demoralized, and most of them are surrendering without a fight, or many of them have retreated, and some have even crossed over the border over here near the Kunduz province into Tajikistan, and they have sought refuge in the neighboring country. As of now, the Afghan government is in control of only the provincial capitals and the cities. But even these urban centers are completely surrounded by the Taliban. So very likely, once the foreign troops completely withdraw by September, the Taliban is most likely to step up its offensive against the Afghan government. And very soon, in the coming weeks, we might witness the fall of Afghan cities, including its provincial capitals and the national capital itself, that is Kabul. So right now, Afghanistan is facing a serious risk of total collapse and a possible return of the country to Taliban's fundamentalist rule with the strict implementation of the Sharia law. This would mark the end of democracy in Afghanistan, and it would take away all the basic rights that the Afghan people were enjoying over the last 2 decades, including women's rights. In the coming months, if the Taliban were to fully capture power in Afghanistan through a violent offensive, then it is going to have a very serious impact on regional security and regional geopolitics. It is going to spread instability in the region, and we might very well witness a further rise in extremism along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, as the Taliban is known to nurture several terrorist outfits, including the Al Qaeda. For countries like India, the biggest concern would be Taliban's connections with the ISI and how Pakistan's ISI has nurtured the Taliban as a part of its covert proxy war against India. India's biggest concern is about possible Pakistani attempts to link the Afghan conflict with the Kashmir conflict and create a support base for anti-India terror groups like the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed by linking them with other extremist outfits like the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. So as the situation rapidly deteriorates in Afghanistan, the editorial expresses grave concern at the developments, and it points out that it is still not very clear as to what exactly is Taliban's strategy. Because in Doha, where Taliban has a political office, Taliban representatives have confirmed that the group is committed to a political dialogue in order to work out a peaceful settlement that will provide for the complete withdrawal of all foreign troops, accompanied with the establishment of a new power structure in Afghanistan. This was what was supposed to happen as per the peace deal that the US had worked out, and such a settlement should have emerged through intra-Afghan talks involving the Taliban, the Afghan government, and other political representatives of Afghanistan. But contrary to these commitments, on the ground, Taliban is behaving in a very different manner, and as feared, it has opened a new round of offensive, and it has been making rapid territorial gains by directly challenging the authority of the Afghan government and the Afghan forces. The editorial points out that this dire situation is a direct result of the total abdication of leadership by the United States. Because directly or indirectly, the United States is responsible for the current situation in Afghanistan due to its interference in Afghan affairs since the 1980s. During the Cold War, it was the United States which sponsored the creation of the Afghan Mujahideen as a resistance against the occupying Soviet forces. When the Soviet Union had occupied Afghanistan in 1979, the United States, along with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, they sponsored the creation of a radical extremist outfit, collectively known as the Afghan Mujahideen, to sponsor a guerrilla insurgent war against the occupying Soviet forces. Later in the 1990s, it was the remnants of the Mujahideen who would go on to form the Taliban, which had violently captured power in the 1990s by overthrowing the civilian government, and it went on to establish a fundamentalist government from 1996 to 2001 with the strict enforcement of a rigid version of the Sharia law. While the US invasion of Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks was justified, and even though the international community backed the American invasion under the name of the global war on terror, what was expected out of the United States was a sustained fight against extremists with the help of the international coalition force that the US brought along with it. But what we saw over the last 2 decades was the US losing its focus on the war on terrorism, followed by its series of mistakes which allowed the Taliban to regroup even after being thrown out of power in 2001, thereby dragging the United States and the coalition forces into a prolonged insurgent war. Then, as the war became unpopular, the United States started desperately searching for a quick exit. And when direct negotiations began with the Taliban, the American priority was a quick withdrawal of its troops at any cost, even without working out a suitable peaceful settlement to determine the political future of the country. When direct talks were opened with the Taliban, the US was still negotiating from a position of strength, and the Taliban was still on the back foot. The US should have used this opportunity to seek concessions from the Taliban and ensure that this fundamentalist outfit doesn't resort to violence again once the foreign troops withdraw from the country. But instead, the US showed no interest in working out a peaceful settlement, and it totally abdicated its responsibility in its pursuit of a quick exit. Today, this has allowed the Taliban to regroup, gain its strength back, and carry out rapid territorial gains, which has now placed the Taliban in a position of strength. So in the coming months, even if the Taliban were to open itself for negotiations to work out a political dialogue and a political settlement, it is unlikely that Taliban would give up its control, because then Taliban would be negotiating from a position of strength. It is in this context that the editorial is calling upon regional powers like Russia, India, China, Iran, and of course Pakistan to come together to strive towards preventing a violent takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban. In the current situation, the Taliban sees itself to be left with two options. One is a violent capture of Afghanistan, including its cities and the capital Kabul. But any such violent capture will lead to a lot of bloodshed, and it may not bring the required international legitimacy to the Taliban government of the future. The Taliban is desperately craving this international legitimacy, and many governments may not give Taliban government this recognition if there is a violent takeover, especially if there is a lot of bloodshed in the cities and the provincial capitals. So even the Taliban is interested in the political route to work out a peaceful political settlement. But for this, the Taliban should show willingness to talk to the Afghan government and the political players in Afghanistan and work with regional and global powers to build lasting power structures in Afghanistan, which might help in preserving at least some form of democracy in the country. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, written by the country director of the United Nations Population Fund, India. This column deals with India's demographic dividend, and the column has been published to mark the World Population Day, which is celebrated on the 11th of July. This annual event was started by the UN Development Programme, or the UNDP, in order to increase people's awareness about various population related issues, such as the importance of family planning, gender equality, poverty, maternal health care, and human rights. So the writer begins by pointing out India's positive demographic dividend that the country is going to enjoy over the next 2 to 3 decades. And she reminds us that India has just entered its demographic sweet spot. Meaning, for the next 20 to 30 years, nearly half of India's population will be under the age of 29 years. Just look at this graphic. It clearly represents the demographic potential of India, because for the next 30 years, India will have a majority of its population in the 20 to 59 age group, with a relatively smaller percentage of infants and adolescent people and old age people. So this majority of the population will drive India's economic growth in the coming years, and most of them would be under the age of 29 years. So while this positive demographic dividend presents numerous opportunities for the country, it also creates many challenges. Because on one hand, we have to come out with long-term policies to deal with the aging population post 2050, and in the near to medium term, we need to provide the right kind of opportunities for the young population in order to empower them and ensure that they contribute to India's growth story. So while this young working force will power India's economic growth in the coming decades, they will have to be provided the right kind of education opportunities, good quality healthcare, and the right kind of skill sets. So along with making this population healthy, educated, and skill oriented, they should also be provided with a set of basic rights and choices to develop to their fullest potential, especially with regard to their sexual and reproductive health rights. This essentially refers to the question of one's bodily autonomy, that is, one's own control over their body, and this is going to be very crucial, especially for women and girls. Because when you're talking about demographic dividend and population stabilization, it all boils down to women's fertility and women's reproductive rights. See, today India's population growth is stabilizing, and we are quite close to achieving replacement level fertility, which is 2.1. Currently, India's total fertility rate stands at a national average of 2.2. See, TFR, or total fertility rate, is nothing but the number of children that a woman has in her lifetime. So a country which is looking to stabilize its population, it always tries to achieve replacement level fertility, where on an average a woman produces 2 children who will essentially provide for the replacement of their parents. So if the TFR is brought down to 2.1, then the population of the country will start stabilizing on its own. Right now, most of the states have achieved a TFR of lesser than 2.1, and the national average stands at 2.2. So even though population stabilization is going on, the population growth will continue for few more years because of population momentum. Very soon, India is going to become the most populous country in the world by overtaking China. But after a decade or so, India's population will start to stabilize because of India's progress towards achieving replacement level fertility. But however, there is a lot of concern with regard to high TFR levels among some women, especially amongst those women who are from rural areas, who are from poor backward states, and those who have low income and low literacy rates. This is not just a coincidence, because all these factors are related to sexual and reproductive health rights of women and girls. So the writer says that even as India will start enjoying the benefits of its demographic dividend, and even as it starts dealing with the challenges of population stabilization, our policies need to keep in mind the rights of women and girls, especially their reproductive rights and their right to bodily autonomy, because this will provide them a greater choice in planning their pregnancies and in determining their family size. Generally, in traditional conservative societies, these tasks and these functions are carried out by the society, and social norms dictate these choices. Be it the marriage age of women, or be it the decision to get pregnant and have children, and even other decisions such as abortion, delivery, childcare, they're all unfortunately determined by societal norms. And especially in patriarchal societies, women lose these rights completely and they get to have no choice in these factors, as the husband's family, the society, and the social norms decides it for them. In this context, the writer points out the importance of empowering women and girls so that they are able to exercise their sexual and reproductive health rights and assert their bodily autonomy and bodily independence. See, in this regard, coercive state led policies such as two child policy or one child policy are clearly ineffective. There are experiences from around the world which has already proven this. Recently, in the state of Assam, the government has come out with a controversial two child policy. Such reproductive and family planning policies are not only ineffective, but they are also counterproductive. Lessons from China should provide us an example of how not to meddle with family matters, because its coercive one child and two child policy has led to a demographic disaster where today the country is left to deal with an aging population. And this has forced China right now to open up its family planning policies and recognize the sexual and reproductive health rights of its citizens. So, such coercive policies are unlikely to yield results and they are going to be ineffective and counterproductive. So, the best way to contain the family size and promote the usage of contraception is by empowering women and girls and by providing them the choice and by making them exercise their independence over their bodily autonomy. This is where it is important for the government to focus on women healthcare and reproductive healthcare, include this as a part of education, that is, introduce sex education at a very young age, and also make women financially independent by securing jobs and employment for them. Studies around the world have clearly shown that women who exercise bodily autonomy, women who are educated and literate, and those women and girls who are financially independent, they always make better choices with regard to family planning and marriage, and even with regard to usage of contraception by judiciously exercising their sexual and reproductive health rights. But however, the biggest challenge for this comes from outdated social norms, where a patriarchal society decides the reproductive rights of women and exercises control or influence over women's bodily autonomy. The writer says that these were the reasons why India failed to achieve the targets of the Programme of Action under the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development. The negative social norms had hindered India's progress with regard to sexual and reproductive health rights of women and girls, and in the coming decades as well, India is going to face the same challenge. But thankfully, over the last 2 to 3 decades, India has made significant progress with regard to women's rights and gender equality. And thanks to progressive policies and government initiatives, several key indicators with regard to reproductive health have actually improved. India has seen major success with regard to maternal mortality rate, and with improved institutional delivery, India's MMR has fallen significantly from 327 in 99-2001 to just 113 per 1 lakh live births in 2016-18. Surveys have also shown that today Indian women are making better choices with regard to family planning, and even the adoption of contraception has gone up, thereby indicating the success of India's family planning programs. Then other empowerment initiatives such as Beti Bachao Beti Padhao Andolan has made women more self-aware about their sexual and reproductive health rights. But despite all this progress, there are several poor indicators that highlight the challenge that India is going to face in the coming years. The writer is of the opinion that these negative social factors will hinder India's progress towards achieving some of the sustainable development goals by 2030. Because even today in the Indian society, early marriage, early motherhood, and unwanted pregnancies are very much prevalent, and most of them are an outcome of the negative social norms. Studies have shown that nearly 63% of pregnancies in the country were unwanted or unintended, and this clearly points to inadequate information and access to sexual and reproductive health services for young women. The National Family Health Survey has also shown that girls in the age group of 15 to 19 years reported a 22.2% unmet need for contraception. Surveys have pointed out that girls are still being married off young, and nearly 27% of the women in the age group of 20 to 24 years have said that they were married off just as they turned 18. Due to India's prevalent social norms, women are forced to have children in the very first year of their marriage, thereby taking away their sexual reproductive health rights and compromising their bodily autonomy. Upon this, there are many socially sanctioned, violent, harmful practices which leads to gender-based discrimination against women and girls. It's as a result of these negative social norms that India's ranking on the Global Gender Gap Report has fallen, and in the latest 2021 report brought out by the World Economic Forum, India has slipped by a shocking 28 positions to be ranked 140th out of 156 countries. This makes India the third worst performer in South Asia, and it highlights the extent of gender inequality and gender gap in the Indian society. So the writer concludes by saying that if India has to exploit its positive demographic dividend potential, and if it has to achieve population stabilization as planned, then we need to make a beginning by empowering our women and girls and by providing them the right kind of education, healthcare, employment, along with the right kind of social status so that they are able to challenge the social norms and make their own independent choices with regard to their sexual and reproductive health. Now let's take up an article from page number 8, which deals with the topic of recusal of judges. According to the article, Justice Kaushik Chanda of the Calcutta High Court has recused himself from Mamata Banerjee's election-related case. Justice Kaushik Chanda has recorded the reasons for his recusal, as the parties involved in the case had questioned his integrity and had raised concerns of him possibly being biased in the case. Based on these aspersions that have been cast against the judge has decided to recuse himself from the case. So let's understand in detail what is recusal of judges from ongoing cases. See, recusal of a judge from a case is nothing but the withdrawal of the judge from a particular case. This withdrawal is voluntary and done by the judge himself. Such a recusal or a withdrawal might be required when there is a conflict of interest in the case. That is, if the judge himself or herself, if they seem to have some sort of connection with the case or with either of the parties. For example, this conflict of interest could be in the form of the judge holding shares in a company which happens to be one of the parties to a case, or the judge having some sort of personal association with either of the parties. In such cases, the judge might decide to recuse themselves or to withdraw themselves from the case in order to prevent the emergence of any perception of bias on their part. This is done to protect their own integrity and as well as to preserve the faith of the public in the judiciary, as we trust the judiciary to be an independent and unbiased body. So when there is a conflict of interest, a judge can withdraw from hearing a case to prevent creating this perception that he or she might be biased while deciding upon the case. This practice stems from the cardinal principle of due process of law that nobody can be a judge in their own case. Any interest or conflict of interest would be a ground to withdraw from a case since a judge has a duty to act fair. There could also be another instance for the judge to recuse themselves from the case. This could happen in case of an appeal at the Supreme Court against a previous judgment of the High Court, when the judge who had delivered this judgment at the High Court today is a judge of the Supreme Court, and if the appeal comes to the same judge, then it again represents a conflict of interest. The judge would be sitting in judgment of their own previous judgment of the High Court, and it again represents a case of conflict of interest. So in such cases, the judges decide to recuse themselves or withdraw themselves from the case in order to prevent the perception of bias from either of the parties and the public, in order to avoid getting into such situations of conflict of interest. But however, there is no formal process for recusal or withdrawal. A judge can decide to recuse themselves from the case based on their personal discretion, and it solely rests on their conscience. But however, lawyers and the parties, that is the litigants in the case, even they can bring any such matter of conflict of interest in front of the court and ask for the judge to recuse himself from the case. Once the judge withdraws from the case, then the case is listed before the Chief Justice again for fresh allotment to a fresh bench. So even though there are no formal rules that define recusal, there are several Supreme Court judgments that have dealt with the issue. For example, look at the Ranjit Thakur case of 1987. In this case, the Supreme Court said that the test of the likelihood of bias is the reasonableness of the apprehension in the mind of the party concerned. That is, the proper approach for the judge is not to look at his own mind and ask himself that whether he would be biased in this case, but instead he should look at the mind of the party before him and see whether the party is holding the perception that the judge might be biased. Personally, the judge might be of great integrity and he personally might feel that he would be unbiased in the case. Despite the conflict of interest, a judge might be confident about his conscience and his integrity, and he might be very determined to be as unbiased as possible in the case. But however, this should not be the basis for the judge to decide whether he has to recuse or withdraw from the case. Instead, he should look at the perceptions held by the parties. If either of the parties have a doubt, if they raise questions on the integrity of the judge, and if they bring up the conflict of interest, then the judge has to look at this from the perspective of the party, and then he has to decide whether he has to withdraw from the case. This argument was brought out by the Supreme Court in the Ranjit Thakur case. So today this has become the basis for judges to decide for themselves whether they have to recuse or withdraw from a particular case. But however, judges can even refuse to recuse or withdraw from a case despite having the conflict of interest and despite concerns being expressed by the parties. Such refusal to recuse has happened in the past. For example, in 2019, Justice Arun Mishra had refused to recuse himself from a constitution bench that was set up to re-examine a judgment he himself had delivered previously. But on the other hand, in the Ayodhya Ram Janmabhoomi case, Justice Lalit recused himself from the constitution bench after the parties brought to his attention that he had appeared as a lawyer in one of the criminal cases relating to the case. Now the question is, do judges record their opinion or do they provide reasons while they recuse themselves from the case? See, since there are no formal rules governing the process, it is often left to individual judges to record the reasons for their recusal. Some judges disclose the reasons in open court, whereas in some cases, the reasons are apparent. Then on page number 7, we have a column that is related to the plight of migrant workers whose lives were turned upside down by the pandemic and the lockdown. This article covers the latest guidelines that were laid down by the Supreme Court, and I request you to go through this column once because we have covered this topic repeatedly in the past. Now coming to the mains practice questions, the first question: with the Taliban making rapid advances in Afghanistan, what does the future hold for the country and the region? Examine. The second question: India has entered a demographic sweet spot, so it is time for our population stabilization strategy to be adjusted, keeping in mind the rights of women and girls. Discuss. Kindly write an answer for these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.